Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan is the topic for today's online lesson. This discussion is important both for students attempting Kubla Khan as part of their university examination and as their tutorial assignment. For the university examination, 3 topics or questions would be very important to prepare. The first being whether Coleridge's text is an opium-induced creation or a poem written under the influence of opium completely. The second being whether Kubla Khan is a poem about the poetic process itself or what George Watson calls a poem about poetry. Third topic would be a consideration of images and their symbolic implications in Kubla Khan. The first slide in today's presentation is about various artists attempting to pictorially illustrate what a text like Kubla Khan envisions. It's very important to look at these illustrations to actually understand the images and symbolic significance of the number of allusions and images which Coleridge structures and builds in the course of the poem. To begin with then, in the first stanza, Coleridge talks about this great emperor, Kubla Khan, great because of the grand creation, the stately pleasure dome that he orders to be built, where the river, which is the most sacred of rivers, flows beside to a sea which does not receive the light of the sun anymore. To understand why Coleridge at all refers to this Chinese emperor is to understand the response of the romantic artist towards a world which wasn't known to them in their everyday living. This world is specifically the world of the East, and since this world is not known to them, we could call it the exotic, or the Orient, which is exotic in nature. The Mongol emperor, referred to by Coleridge, builds this dome according to a certain structure, according to a certain geometrical and mathematical precision, which structures not only the physical concreteness of the dome, but also structures the natural objects of the trees and the flowers in the garden, and even the play of light and shadow, which is referred to in the last line, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. The illustration makes it clear that this kind of a creation by a human being may be grand, may be beautiful, may be the first indication of a rebellion by a human being to tame or control nature, but it is also, therefore, because of these very reasons, also limited. The second illustration in your slide is about a completely different kind of creation, very different from the human creation of Kubla Khan. Of course, it has a number of links to Kubla Khan's creation. It's similarly grand, it's similarly stately, and it's similarly huge, but it's distinct or different in one key measure, which is that it does not aim to tame or control nature, but it aims to represent nature. Romantic poetry, as we all know, is about returning to nature in its most primal, in its most primitive of aspects. And Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in the second stanza of his poem Kubla Khan, represents what romantic imagination, what romantic nature, and what romantic creation is all about. And he encompasses all of these ideas in the 3 key words of the first line of the second stanza, that is the deep romantic chasm. It's important to know that the word romantic is not written with a capital R, because for Coleridge, what he means by romantic is the only meaning that can be had of this term. It's nothing significant, it's nothing special. It's the only meaning that he knows, it's the only meaning which the people of the late 19th century artistic mind would know, and therefore it's the only meaning for him. Kubla Khan's creation is grand, it's stately, it's pleasure, or it gives pleasure, but it's not romantic in nature. So, the kind of creation which Coleridge presents in the second, from the beginning of the second stanza, is about this deep chasm or a deep gap in the mountain which has no limitation on its depth, and it's also called a place which is savage. We must remember that when Edward Said, in his book on Orientalism, when he was writing about Orientalism, he said that for the Western mind, the Eastern world is the world of the exotic, it's the world of the uncivilized, and it's also the world of the savage, which the Westerners were attempting to make civilized and make less savage. But the point is, Coleridge here, and we must therefore differentiate the point of view of Coleridge the artist and the typical Western mind bent upon colonial expansion and imperialist projects, that the artistic mind of Coleridge says that the best of the romantic creation is a savage creation, that which exists before civilization was created, and therefore that which does not have the limitations, the geometrical and the mathematical limitations of human civilization. And it's a world which is savage, which is untamed, it is holy, it is sacred, and it is enchanted or magical, as if there is an influence of supernatural powers, of extraterrestrial powers, which cannot be understood by the people living in a civilized world. And to explain all of these ideas of the supernatural trappings that he uses, or the supernatural influences that he uses an illusion from the supernatural or the Gothic world, which his readers or his audience would understand, which is the line, "A woman wailing for her demon lover." Here, two words are important. One is that the lover is demonic in nature, the lover is a being from the other world, and that the relationship between the woman and the lover is characterized by extreme intimate grief and intimate passion. The grief which is born out of passion, the grief which is born out of a separation from the being whom the woman passionately loves. It's a very intimate, it's a very deep relationship in which these two are entwined, because these two are not simple human beings. Therefore, what Coleridge is saying within the scope of these few lines is not only that he's actually trying to conjure a world which is romantic, he's not only trying to conjure a world which is supernatural in nature, he's not only trying to conjure a world which is haunted, which is savage, which is Gothic, but he's also making us conscious of two very key ideas which he discusses in Biographia Literaria chapter 14, which are the concepts of the primary and the secondary imagination. At this point, I would just like to explain what these two concepts mean. Primary imagination is the innate sense of the power of imagination within any being. And secondary imagination are the various examples, illustrations, references, symbolic allusions used to explain or to represent that innate sense of being able to imagine to us. For example, if I am writing a poem where I want to convey a certain sense of imagination, I wouldn't be able to do that if I don't write it in words. When I will write it in words, obviously I will use a language which I know. I will use a number of images and symbols about which I have a greater understanding. The secondary imagination, as far as Coleridge understands it, are those illustrations or examples which a writer must use to represent an idea which is embedded deep within himself. The reference from the supernatural world, and in the course of the poem there will be a number of other references which Coleridge will use to represent that innate sense of his being able to imagine about the process of creativity itself. Creativity is about, when he represents about creativity as imposition, as a kind of a dictatorship, he uses the secondary imagination or the example of the Chinese or the Mongol emperor and his dictatorial stance. When he talks about a creation which is holy, which is magical, which is supernatural in nature, he gives an example of the supernatural world which constitutes secondary imagination. To move on then, the next slide is about how, when the river Alf is flowing alongside the dome, how is it moving along this deep chasm or this deep gap? And he says that it is moving with a certain ceaselessness or an unstoppable nature. Water and the movement of water in a stream or a river is not something which you can curb or stop at a certain point. It continues inevitably, just like life continues inevitably. It may have a momentary pause in death, but of course then it revives and recontinues with another life, with or in another being. And it is also important to note that Coleridge is not only talking about the process of movement forward, he's talking about the kind of movement. For example, as if the earth in fast, thick pants were breathing. He's talking about creation or the birth of any created object, as if a mother is giving birth to a child. This kind of this fast, thick pants is this fast, thick breath which is taken is almost like a mother during or a mother enduring the pains of childbirth. And it's important to make this connection between a mother giving birth to a child and a poet giving birth to his poem, because for Coleridge or for the romantic mind, a poem comes from that deep within the self. Just like there is an organic and a biological relationship between the mother and the child, similarly, there is an organic and a biological relationship between the poem and the poet. The next line begins to describe how the creation began. The river Alf had its source in the mountain, and with the bursting of the huge rock, the stream or the river began its course. We must here not only understand the originary point of the river, but also the huge or the immense force with which any creation is born. Just like the creation of the world by God. It's a huge force, it's a grand force which a human being is not quite able to achieve. And all of these descriptions are basically are sort of indicating or making us conscious of the kind of limitations which Kubla Khan's creation is. It may be again stately, it may be again grand, but it doesn't really encompass or doesn't originate with this immense power. And then the next line continues about amid whose half into swift, half-intermittent burst, huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or Shafi grain beneath the thresher's flail. Here, talking about the way in which, when the river moves, it breaks into millions of pieces, those grand boulders, and into small pieces, just like you would separate grain from the husk. It's that powerful, and it's that minutely breaking up the huge pieces of, or the huge boulders of rock into small minute pieces. Of course, the reference here to the agricultural metaphor of the Shafi grain and the thresher is again the kind of an extreme hard work which an agricultural laborer puts into the agricultural growth that he undertakes, as well as food being one of the staple requirements of human existence, just as water is, similarly food. The next line, he talks about the breaking of these rocks, the breaking of these boulders into millions of minute pieces of rocks. But one word is very important, that these are the dancing rocks. For Coleridge, or for many other important Romantic Age writers, music and dance are again other forms of creation or other forms of imagination which are very close to the artistic consciousness, or which represents artistic imagination or artistic creative processes in its most authentic sense, because these are gestural forms which do not use language, because we all know that language, say for example when I'm speaking in English, it would be comprehensible only to people who know the language. But it's not so with music, which is basically about tonality, and it is also not so with dance, which is basically about bodily gesture. That would be comprehensible to people from who know other languages, who are from very remote places of the world. So the river Alf, when it's moving along its course, is breaking the rocks into millions of minute pieces, and when it reaches towards the end, it becomes that grand sacred river which accompanies, or which is a part of the grand sacred world, and it's meandering with a mazy motion. Here, of course, it's important to note the word 5 miles. There was also 5 miles of fertile ground in the first stanza. There's also 5 miles of meandering with a mazy motion in this latter part of the poem. But of course, that 5 miles were a concrete, it was twice 5 miles. That was a concrete reference to 10 miles only. But here, of course, it's a meandering 5 miles. It really cannot be comprehended only into 5 or limited to 10 or just guessed at 15. It's something which is moving and something which will continue to move till the end of time. And then, of course, it moves through river and forest, and it reaches a cavern which is measureless to man. Of course, in the first stanza, it was the sea where the light of the sun would not reach, and of course here it's reaching into a cave which a human being cannot measure. Of course, a very direct reference to Kubla Khan's kind of creation, and sang in tumult into a lifeless ocean. The phrase, the two words, lifeless ocean, of course, a very clear indication to the world of the Dead Sea, which is referred to in the sunless, quote unquote, in the first stanza, where the light of the sun does not reach the very depths of the sea, and therefore any kind of life living in the depths of the sea cannot live, and therefore its lifeless. And amid this tumult, Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. This kind of war, or this kind of battle, is between man and nature. That which we are facing each day, for example, when there are earthquakes, when there are floods, which completely destroys human beings, because human beings at one point of time had attempted to control or tame nature. Of course, Kubla Khan's attempt is a great attempt. It's a great initiative, and it's a pioneering initiative on the part of a human being to build a civilization in the first place. Without this attempt, civilization wouldn't exist, human beings wouldn't exist, their world, their progress wouldn't exist. But Coleridge is just saying that if this man-made creation continues unabated, where everything of nature is almost annihilated or completely destroyed, then of course nature will speak out. The ancient generations of human existence, to quote from the poem, forest ancient as the hills, will speak out against any kind of human creation. And this is the battle which nature is challenging Kubla Khan with. And it's a war which is being prophesied, and which of course Kubla Khan almost is in awe of. Here, of course, I will also make you all a little conscious about a concept which Longinus referred to in his book on the sublime, that when you stand in front of a creation of nature which is huge, which is grand, the feeling of awe, AWE, is a feeling which is very common, that nature's creation is so grand that it almost frightens you, that you really cannot comprehend it. And this kind of fright or this kind of awe is something which Kubla Khan is making very clear, or which here Kubla Khan is very clear about when it's being used as a challenge to him. This next slide is about this dome of pleasure which is floating midway on the waves. We must remember that the dome which Kubla Khan builds is the predominant symbol in this poem. But here, of course, Coleridge is not talking about the physical concrete dome, but the shadowy dome, or a reflection of the dome which has been built. It's important to remember that in a shadow or in a reflection, you do not have physical boundaries. Therefore, it does not have exact measurements, and therefore, it also does not helpfully have exact limitations. Therefore, this reflected dome has a very close connection with one of the primal images of life, that is water. It's floating midway on the waves, where it was heard. The mingled measure of music is something which is very closely associated with romantic imagination. And in this following slide, Coleridge talks about the music which is loud, which is long, which is loud enough to penetrate deep within the human self, that measureless self, that limitless self, that deep self, and which is also long enough to be able to comprehend or to be able to construct and complete, most importantly, the process of romantic creation. It's important to concentrate on the word long, because most critics feel that Coleridge's poem, if we are considering it as a fragment, that it's incomplete. It's fragmentary and therefore it's incomplete. The point which I'm trying to make is that Coleridge is very conscious when he says that he has been able to, if at all, imbibe music for such a length of time to be able to complete the process of romantic imagination. Imagination, if it occurs, it comes across as a vision and it's completed. Otherwise, it doesn't exist. It's not something which one can come and interrupt and you then let go as an artist. Therefore, if we are considering Coleridge's poem as a fragment, it is because any kind of creation is incomplete by, if we are measuring it in terms of its perfection. An artist always attempts to create something which is perfect. When he does create it, it is perfect for the time. But of course, when he attempts his next creation, it becomes imperfect in comparison with the next creation. Therefore, it becomes incomplete in that sense. Therefore, Coleridge's poem, since it's talking about the very process of poetic creation, since it's talking about the way in which an artist moves from one kind of a creation to another kind of a creation, realizing the limitations of one and the other, and moving forward along with it. Therefore, it could be considered incomplete or fragmentary in that sense, because poetry or creation is only about the pursuit of creation. Since a pursuit is never complete, therefore a poem is never complete, and therefore it could be a fragment. And so, to continue, he says that I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice. The final dome, moving from the physical dome which Kubla Khan had built to the reflected dome which was floating midway on the waves, we finally come to the airy dome. That symbolic representation of the most spiritual of creations that an artist is able to actually achieve. Of course, we must remember that this airy dome is not something which he has created, but which he wants to create. It's the most perfect of creation which every artist desires to achieve, but of course, desire and reality are not always things which walk hand in hand. And of course, this kind of a most perfect creation is miraculous and, again to repeat, paradoxical. Sunny dome, caves of ice. The final stanza is about the reception of this kind of a romantic creation. When students are dealing with the topic on meta poetry or the process of poetic creation in Kubla Khan, or they are attempting their university examination on whether one would consider Kubla Khan as a poem on poetry, you should also talk about the process of receiving a text. The reader responds to a certain text, and Coleridge here is discussing that in his 19th century text, though reader response theory is something which comes much later in the at the beginning of the 21st century. And he says, all who should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware. His flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread. For he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. When we witness the creation of such a miraculous thing, when we witness the creation of such a paradoxical nature, we are completely enthralled by it. We are in awe of it, as if we are standing in front of something, to refer to a term by Longinus, sublime. We are standing in front of something which is grand. It's as if like we are witnessing a person who is no more a person, but almost becomes similar to God. Therefore, the reference to the honeydew, therefore, a reference to the milk of paradise. It's almost like a human being becoming God in the process of creating the most godlike and the most miraculous and the most paradoxical of creations. Therefore, Kubla Khan's text, it ends with the creator being that miraculous or that sublime figure. We must remember that Coleridge is not really considering himself to this figure more, but importantly, he is considering himself as someone who could become this figure at some point of his creative process. In this regard, it is also important to consider the preface which Coleridge had written as an introductory note to Kubla Khan, where he is explaining the way in which a text like Kubla Khan was received. It was considered almost like a psychological aberration. It was almost considered as something which is incomprehensible, little difficult, almost elusive, not quite clear and not quite realistic. We must remember that the author Coleridge, when he's explaining these things, is communicating to the reader that you should not always consider an artist to be godlike. You should also consider an artist to be practical, to be realistic, someone who understands the obstacles that life presents itself with, someone who understands that still, despite these obstacles, a perfect creation can be attempted, and if not made, at least strived for. Therefore, Coleridge's poem is, again to repeat, is not about the perfect of creations, but a pursuit towards that perfection. Thank you.